Hi everyone, another episode of the podcast Tačka, ključanja, effectively translating to boiling point. My name is Goran Chetkovic and my guest today is Moira Whelan, which is why we're doing an episode in English. She's a director at the National Democratic Institute representing the Democracy and Technology team. She's an experienced communications professional working at the intersection of democracy, technology, and policy. While at the US State Department, she helped form the first cohort of digital diplomats. Today we spoke about disinformation. Once again, we spoke about the impacts of social media on the ways the disinformation can spread. We spoke about policies and the way to handle and fight against, and we spoke about the activities the NDI is undergoing across the world. Enjoy. Moira, welcome to Montenegro and welcome to the podcast, essentially called Boiling Point in Montenegrin.
Thank you for having me. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's my first visit to Montenegro.
Yeah, perfect. I'm pretty sure you haven't managed to go through Montenegro much yet, but maybe in coming days, if you're still around.
But this is my first stop, of course,
to
come talk to you.
The podcast is the first step,
Absolutely.
To all future guests, this is the step. This is the first step. So the topic of today's conversation is probably it is my passion topic and is one of the most important topics of today's age. Is called disinformation. And before we go further into discussion, can you define for me what disinformation represents to you? I know there's a Wikipedia definition that we can all read, but what does it mean to you being in the digital space for such a long time?
Well, where we like to talk about it at the National Democratic Institute is about information manipulation. And the reason we choose that is because whether information is true or false is sometimes more about how it's used. It's also about some of the harms that we see happening online that may be hate speech, maybe aggressive behavior, that expand our concept of the issues that we have to address with how people engage online, especially in political discourse.
Well, what's very, hard for me, and I'm sure a lot of people, if we're living in a sort of post-truth world where information used to have more value than it does today. And how do you draw the line between what is correct and what is not correct? Because it seems like everybody has their own opinions and perspectives, and they can explain their perspectives better. So how do you say this is what is incorrect, and pushing this agenda means spreading this information? How do we draw the line?
Well, we like to think about it in terms of free expression, that everyone should have the right to fully participate in the conversation and be their true selves. But that also means that it draws the line if I'm going to use that power to do harm to another person. And so where we see this breaking down is in the political arena, very much so, when we talk about our divisions, our disagreements being amplified in the space that we live in. When we talk about what we can do to address it and how to process that information coming to us, we need to think about it in terms of thinking about how we would behave with someone on the street. How we would interact online is how we would interact offline. For most of everyone listening to us and everyone watching us, there's no difference between online and offline anymore. I'm from the ancient times when you could still make that distinction. But we have to think about ourselves as citizens, being in a public square, participating in the internet in the way we want to see it. Nobody wants to go into a dirty park. Nobody wants to be unsafe after dark. And we need to think about the internet the same way.
But it's a very interesting focus of how people feel free to say things in digital space that they would definitely, not even to the same person, say, talking face to face. And that barrier of a mirror, of a screen allows them so much, especially if it's anonymous. And there have been many situations with anonymous platforms where, like ICAC, I remember in my time when I lived in the United States, it went viral because of how much people were allowed to do without standing beside those words. Not even just the face, but the words. But even with social media today, if it's a question I like to ask people on this topic, if you had the power to do a shutdown of social media or keep it alive, do you still see it as a net positive force? What would you do to it if you were allowed to do some major changes?
When it comes to democracy, I'm very much against shutting down social media in any way, and making sure that it is accountable to being the internet that we want and we need to see. If I could reset a lot of things, I think that we didn't start from the premise of putting ourselves and putting people at the center of the internet. We started with algorithms. We started with a belief and a promise and a faith that it was all just going to work out and that we didn't need to set rules of the road. But when we all drive down the street, we know we need stop signs. We know we need stoplights. They're irritating when there's a lot of traffic, but we know we need those social barriers to help us all engage in the conversation and the flow of information in a way that helps us get information. For instance, there's nothing wrong with small bubbles, small groups where you can exchange information. Around the world, we see that really enabling democratic movements where they can have a safe space to talk online privately in encrypted rooms and decide how they're going to address a dictator, how they're going to confront someone doing harm to them online. That's a space that we need to preserve. But we're also seeing that same space be manipulated, used not just for malign influence in politics, but crime, attacks on children, on women. And that's where we have to get a lot smarter and we have to do a lot more work.
Because in the past 2 decades, since the beginning of the social media, there's a correlation between the amount of disinformation spread online and obviously social media being alive. And that's why I asked, does it make sense? Because for example, is there a more nuanced approach in place that we could actually take, I don't know, use WhatsApp and Viber and chat applications like that, Telegram and so forth, and do something to the social media to disable such spread? Because everyone now has a forum to emit the information. How do we justify ability to allow everyone? I know there's a freedom of speech component, obviously, so now we're getting to the balance of how do we draw the line between the freedom of speech and being able to regulate actual disinformation, because information itself is so vague.
Right. And it's not easy.
Yeah. I mean, it's the hardest question today.
And obviously, right. But we've also seen what happens when we just allow Silicon Valley to make all those decisions for us.
Exactly.
That doesn't work, right?
Exactly.
And it doesn't work because every community is different. You bring in linguistic differences, cultural differences. What a word means here is different than what a word means in the United States or in Europe. And how that's taken, how a particular word is taken either as an insult or being friendly towards someone can depend on, your race, your ethnicity, your gender, and what we then need to do and how we have to think about this is more of a process and more of a structure than it is a piece of legislation.
What do you mean by that?
I mean that in order for us to get this right, we have a complicated, really boring, because let's just make it as boring as possible, approach called the multi-stakeholder system and the multi-stakeholder framework. What does that mean? It means that governments, civil society groups, tech companies all have to have a constant conversation about this. And we have to look not just at the content and what the picture looks like or what the words say, but also what people are doing with it. If you're getting inundated because of something you said, maybe that's malign influence. Maybe somebody is brigading you. Maybe somebody has targeted you. Mm-hmm. So we need to look at that in terms of behavior, and we need to have a constant conversation going on.
But what is that forum? Where is that communication happening between the government, between the civil sector, between the private companies? What is the forum that we can facilitate to enable that?
So there are some good examples around the world. I will say all of this is a work in progress. And when it comes to what we've done, you mentioned we've been doing this for 20 years, right? This isn't new.
Exactly.
But at the same time, getting to what works has taken us a long time. So let's think about some examples that work. My favorite is Taiwan. If you've never visited, it's fabulous.
I'll be waiting a couple of years before.
Well, to give you an idea of how great it is, all the digital rights activists will be there in February because that's where we gather to discuss these issues. But why do we like that model? One, it's citizen-driven. Like groups of hackers, interested citizens are developing the tools. Second, they have a close coordination with the government, who then, for instance, if there's an issue you want your parliament to address, if it gets enough support, it has to be by law considered by their parliament. And then third is that accountability factor with technology companies. That's happened in a number of ways. One, not really by the companies themselves saying we really want to do this, but driving those conversations by civil society who are detecting disinformation, attacks in their case coming from China. But then the last component is also teaching people. So they have really interesting chatbots that are funny, Like they're engaging and they make you laugh, but they also help identify disinformation. And they cause that really important factor, which is for us to stop, pause, think about what we're looking at, think about what we're going to do with that, maybe not forward it right away, maybe question whether it's true, and then take a moment and go check another source and see, is that really true? And when we think about our daily lives, we do that anyway. You hear about a band you like coming in, you heard it on the radio, but then you go check another source. You go to the band's website. Are they really coming? Are the tickets going to be available? You do that for the things you care about. And what we need to do is take information, especially information around important things like elections, divisive social issues, and ask ourselves, is this true? Is this something that I want to share in order for us not to be part of the problem? But I will say, so far what we've seen is technology companies have put a lot of that responsibility on us, and we need them, and we need governments, and we need political parties and other entities to take more of a role in setting the rules of the road for themselves so that it doesn't all fall to us.
But where do we jump in? Like in that vicious circle of government, private, and citizens complaining, where do we actually start? Do we, I don't know, is that laws that we need to propose? Is that private companies being transparent about their algorithms and showing us what they're doing to us? Like, where do we, what is the start? What is the starting point?
So I'll give you an example. I work quite a bit on violence against women in politics. And what we've come to learn as NDI is that this is a global problem. It's the number one reason that women choose not to run for office, because
digital violence.
Yes, because they experience hate speech and attacks on their appearance, on their, quality as a mother, or the fact that they're not a mother, whether they're married or not married.
And you're speaking, you're only speaking about the United States?
Oh, no, this is a global problem.
Okay.
And it's the number one reason around the world that women choose not to run for office, not just because it happens to them, but when they see it happen to another woman. So if you see that happening, you're like, I'm not going there. I don't want to expose my family to that. I don't want to lose my identity. I don't want to be attacked that way. And so for us, it's a democracy problem. So how do we solve that? Well, the number one thing is, okay, we can look to tech companies and say there are harms happening and they need to address it. That's important, and that does need to happen, and they're not doing enough. But we're also not looking a lot closer to home. For instance, are political parties signing a code of conduct so they don't attack each other in that way? Are they committing during an election to not just stick to the issues, which is where we want them to be, but instead go low and attack each other for their ethnic background or...
It's what moves people.
Well, because it's the shock value.
Yeah.
So can't we hold them accountable and say, we're not going to vote for you.
Yeah.
We want to see a code of conduct that says you're going to behave that way. Yes, legislation, we should be regulating social media companies because those parliamentarians need to take the step to hold those companies accountable. And we've seen success in that front when it's protecting children, fighting terrorist groups. We can extend that. We can get bigger, but it also has to be implemented. Judges have to admit that into a hearing. Police need to know that a threat online is why should you wait for someone outside your door threatening to beat you up before you do something about it?
So, I mean, on the same topic, the social media companies have been known to undermine democratic processes and just the pure trust of people in their own governments because of how they censor and limit and promote information. Are there any successes of any country that has managed, from your experience, to do this in the right way, to negotiate with social media companies, either coming from the United States or China or elsewhere, to actually manage their case well? Do we have any success stories?
We have some success stories. One's really in the news right now. I think it's being mischaracterized in some ways. But in Brazil, they have a governance structure over their internet that was passed through law, and people from civil society help govern the internet. That's what kept the internet on when Bolsonaro, when they had an election. He obviously wants to turn off the internet to keep people from being able to operate and have opinions during the election. So we saw a success rate there. We also then saw that their law demanded that all social media companies have a presence on the ground and understanding. It wasn't even like you have to have a person sitting in an office in Brasilia, but X decided that they weren't going to do that. they weren't going to listen to the law. And so now what we see is the Brazilian government saying, here are the conditions that you have to meet to be in our public conversation, to run our public park.
That was towards X?
Yes,
or just
and now
across
X
the board?
has been shut down in Brazil. And that is because the people, the government worked together to say, we have standards for what we expect of companies. Now, remember, all of these companies signed UN commitments to be part of human rights, to defend human rights. So what we're really talking about is holding them accountable to the commitments they've made to live up to their obligations to help us advance human rights, to defend and implement the sustainable development goals that all countries have agreed to. This is it. This is accountability.
But talk to me more about that sort of digital diplomacy. Like, is every country, for example, is US, is EU, and separate countries that are outside of EU and other blocs, are they in charge of negotiating individually with social media companies to handle this issue, or are they joining up as a sort of a block? Is it more widespread? Should the US lead the way when it comes to regulation? Do they each
so far
each for their own?
So far what we've seen is that individual countries are making this work for their citizens. Another great example I like to talk about is in Australia. They have an e-safety commission, and they look at groups like indigenous populations, children, women, persons with disabilities, LGBTQI groups, all of these things. They give them toolkits on how to behave, but they're also empowered to hold companies accountable. So they have to be transparent about how many reports did you get from Australia of people saying they were being harmed, and tell us what you did about it. And all of those companies have to deliver that if they want to continue to operate in Australia. That kind of accountability is great. Now, certainly, it would be better if we could all agree on some general rules of the road. And we're seeing that out of the EU. That was a big step forward. But we also don't want to get blocked in like companies just complying with a thing, turning in a C paper instead of an A+ paper. We want them to we want to see
feel
them.
the pressure.
Yeah, and we want them to be partners with us in defending the very conversation. This is about free expression, right?
Absolutely.
And they thrive on that. So if malign actors want to take that concept away and limit our conversations like we see in spaces like China or in Russia, then it's not good for them either. They're not going to make any money.
Yeah, why am I asking is, for example, there are technologies emerging such as, everyone on the planet has heard about OpenAI and ChatGPT. And plus with the influx of deepfake videos, it's a technology that is widespread. And individual countries, and I probably can speak for Montenegro when I say we don't have enough competent people, not even in the government, to handle this issue. So being able to present our case individually probably is a harder way to go, as opposed to joining a EU bloc or non-EU bloc and go towards the social media companies. Do you see any emerging threats when it comes to these new technologies such as AI, such as deepfakes? How do we battle that?
Definitely see many threats when it comes to that. I will say over the past year, this was very much a year of elections. We're seeing more countries and more people voting this year than ever in history of voting. And we really thought with OpenAI and ChatGPT and other things coming on board, what would we see? Would we see the proliferation of disinformation and those sorts of things? We have seen some. So, for instance, dead people coming back to endorse a particular candidate because it's done through generative AI. But it hasn't been as significant as the organic threats on our institutions, like elections themselves, like challenges to the government, that we see already happening. It was already there. Now, when it comes to what we do about it, because, we can't just be like, that didn't happen, so we're fine.
It's here to stay.
Yeah, right. It's not going anywhere. We spent a good 10, 15 years as governments and people who operate in this space asking nicely for companies to do things. We saw Australia, Taiwan, Brazil, the EU really begin to lead on saying, time's up, we're going to regulate. When generative AI came on the scene, the thing I'm optimistic about is that the number of meetings that governments are having, the action at the United Nations, which will happen later this month in September to begin to address things like harms online and what we do about it. Not just, interestingly, in social media. We're talking about warfare, biotechnology. I mean, these are all things that can both be helped and hurt by that. And we're hearing it from the developers themselves, which is the most important. They're asking for governments to step in. They're asking for more consultation with activists, with people that understand the internet, academics who study harms, psychologists. That's really important. So I'm optimistic about that. It's really messy right now. It's going to take a little while. I don't know if we're going to get there fast enough. And what's fast enough when it keeps changing. But there are more technical experts in governments around the world today than there were 5 years ago. That's pretty fast for government, frankly, unfortunately.
But still, I think it's way too slow when you compare the amount of features that, I don't know, Meta can push out in a given week.
Absolutely. And we are seeing some changes by the companies. For instance, I talked about elections. On the plus side, we're seeing them commit to providing voter information for every national level election around the world, anywhere in the world. So basic stuff. They'll tell you where you can vote, who the candidates are, what day election day is, right? Just the basics. But it's something. We're moving them in the direction to say that to me represents that they know they have a responsibility to help with this problem rather than just ignore it and show us cat videos. That's not everyone. That's not all platforms. They're not all the same. Some do great work. Others are doing terribly. And unfortunately, it has to be a full-time job for conversations like this to hold them accountable.
But can you tell me more about what NDI is doing maybe to help with spreading information, help with promoting correct processes and procedures to handle this?
Sure. Well, we focus, so there are a broad network of groups that focus on everything from debunking to media education and media literacy. Where NDI focuses, because we promote democracy and we work quite a bit in more than 50 countries around the world with political parties, parliamentarians. We're trying to give them the tools they need to do their jobs. And we're trying to give them the tools they need to do their work in creating an information space we all want to be in. So what does that look like and what does that mean? I mentioned codes of conduct and promoting that. We just released a report on how important that is in Latin America, for instance. That can be a really important thing.
Who's the recipient of that sort of information?
We share it with all of our parliamentary partners in the region. And then we don't stop there, right? It's not a report. It's sitting down and saying, what does this mean? Having a workshop. Again, on online violence against women in politics, we asked thousands of women around the world what would make the difference, what can fix this. And yes, it's tech companies. Yes, it's all these things. But in every country, what we noticed is it kind of came down to there might be different things, right? Some may have laws on the books. That's great. But their police don't know that that's admissible or that they should consider it important. Their judges don't admit it to hearing. Mm-hmm. And why are we even waiting that long? Why isn't it stopped in schools? Why can't we go further back? What we found that by having workshops, getting the right people in the room, and believe me, the right people, by the way, are always men and women. They are always persons with disabilities. They are an intersectional group. They're members of parliament, members of civil society. They're political leaders, movement leaders. They're the ones that we ask and say, what are the top 2 or 3 things we can focus on that are going to get us closer to the internet that we deserve? And they're helping to move the needle on that by, in some places, passing laws, parliament, setting rules and fines. Is it always the laws? I think there's no way around regulation being an important piece of it's a basic responsibility. I mean, we regulate baby clothes, we regulate buildings, we regulate, how shirts are made. We can regulate the internet. We can have nice things. And I think that it's really important for them to recognize their responsibility. But more importantly, what NDI also does is realize they don't have to start from scratch. There's good examples out there. We can show you good examples, and then you decide what works for you. But it shouldn't be just the government deciding, because let's be honest, they're government, they're parliamentary. They have a lot of experience in governing on things they know nothing about. But what we want them to do is consult the experts. We want them to be in constant conversation with users and to recognize we're not going to get it one and done, that we're going to constantly have to go back and change this.
But the sort of disinformation is just one side of the coin. The other one being, for example, ever since the evolution of, the rise of social media, there has been, we're swimming in the information, correct and incorrect, mis and disinformation. And so one, I think, psychological component of that is that when you push a lot of information on a person, we tend to be defensive, and then we only look towards the people that we trust, and whatever information they emit, we accept as potentially more truthful than the ones from the people we do not trust. So with that wave of information, even though there's a lot of more information, I think we're reading a lot less from a lot more specific sources. Do you have an opinion of how do we handle the psychological component of this whole flow when it comes to this information?
So I think about this a lot as a parent, right?
Exactly.
And I approach it that way,
parent.
right? And when you talk to tech leaders, for instance, they have bans on their children getting online. And it starts with critical thinking, the thing that we try to teach our children about, like, how do you behave? Hold hands when you cross the street, make sure to say please and thank you, and behave that way, right? In my house, I have on the refrigerator the commitments my kids have made to being online. I let them know that
what are those, if you can speak of them?
Oh, that they have to be nice, that they should never write anything that they wouldn't want me to read, and they should think, even if they're angry, they should stop and put it down. Right now, I also want to be the last mother to let my son have a cell phone, and to keep him in the real world and to keep him thinking critically about the world and introducing him to new things through that. But I can also say that, videos are a powerful tool. Watching him be able to code things that I couldn't do at his age. He fixes my phone for me. My daughter can order food for us, and do the grocery shopping.
But do you suggest them what not to use and what to use, or do you allow them to swim and see for themselves?
No, I absolutely police it. And I think that that's a responsibility that we have when we're talking about adults, of policing what each other look at, and being helpful to someone else, and noticing if they are suffering a psychological trauma, to tell them maybe we disconnect, maybe we put it down, and we reassess what's good and what's bad and what outcomes we're getting for this. Because when you find yourself getting so angry at what you're reading and doom scrolling, right? Exactly. Or even hope scrolling, that you're just putting so much investment in an emotion into that inanimate object, we do have to sit back and ask ourselves if we're approaching it the right way. But the reality is we have to live online, and we need to make sure that these tools work for us. And we are finding places, like I said, where we're seeing people use it to have a better relationship with their government, to identify where a road is broken, be able to get that information to them. Estonia, for instance, you can do everything online with your government except get married and die, right? Like this. Everything else you can do on your phone with an ID. That's a lot of trust, but a lot of us have a long way to go with our governments to getting there, and we need to see more from them before we all give that away and say we're going to trust everyone.
But that's why freedom of speech is such a huge spectrum of, it's not 0-1, it's not let's all talk and let's nobody talk, but still when it comes to emitting information online in digital spaces, I'm sometimes thinking, should we have some sort of like a test, like a certificate that you need to earn to be able to join, I don't know, all these social media companies, be able to comment and put out opinions, because now everyone has a forum? What's your philosophical stance of?
I would really love to see, we talk about getting your driver's license when you reach a certain age, that you have to learn to park, you have to learn to turn, and what the rules are. There's no reason that we can't start thinking about things like that. And there are countries that are doing that. Sweden, Finland have gone a long way in requiring that education among young people at a very early age.
Like media literacy?
Yes,
or just the
media literacy, but also behavior. Should you buy something from that website just because it pops up? And then, we've all had that happen. You're late at night, you order something, and you get a piece of garbage. But then before you know it, your credit card's being used to do buy 2 tickets to an island somewhere that you never purchased. Yeah. And so just stopping and thinking and learning to be more considerate in our digital lives, just like we would in our everyday lives. But you're right. I mean, there are people out there preying on this and preying on our trust of each other, preying on our preconceived notions of division and amplifying them and making them bigger and making them feel like you can't be with that person because they're an other. And that's what our governments really need to show us, an action that looks at everyone and looks at basic fundamental human rights as a baseline for what we deserve when it comes to the online space.
I mean, but then at the end of the day, it's still the bottom line is the profits. So whether you take some like a TikTok or some Chinese influence of a Chinese social network, of US social network, such as Meta, such as X, they still have the profits. They're profit driven, right? So, and the engagement is driven by polarizing content that they show or not show. So how do we, obviously we cannot trust them, but how do we let them censor or promote different topics and say that they will be the ones putting out guidelines of how to use, because at the end of the day, they're running after profits to show to stakeholders. So how do we approach them when it comes to trust?
So I think you're right, they're profit-based, but they only make money if we use their product.
Exactly.
And we're seeing, for instance, on X, people stop using it. One of my favorite examples is Bumble. I don't know if you have Bumble here. Do you?
I don't think
dating
it's
app.
used.
I haven't been in the dating world for a long time. But as a democracy person, here I am saying a dating app is a great example. Why? Because it was intentionally designed to give women a choice and give them more agency in the dating process. So I can't, if I don't want to hear from the guy reaching out to me on Bumble, I can say, I don't want to hear from him. If he sends me a picture I really don't want to see, you know, they will send me a prompt. They'll use AI, again, a positive use of AI to say, we think we know what this is a picture of. Are you sure you want to see it? I can say no. If that guy does that more than 3 times, they deplatform him. Why? Because women will leave the platform and stop paying them money if they don't feel like they're in a safe space on the most intimate details that they're sharing. We see this in other platforms saying, are you sure you want to do that? Are you sure you want to share that? This is from not from a credible source. And putting those warning labels for us that almost operate as like, you know, sometimes it can be a gentle reminder. Sometimes you get the red pop-up from Google saying like, don't go there. And I think those are really important steps, but it's important to know none of those happened, as you said, because we just, the powers that be, and they were just so nice and great. It happened because people saw that there was a demand for a safe space. Even some encrypted platforms, like I'm a big fan of Signal. I don't know which one you use, but we do need a place where I know who I'm talking to. I know where that my information is safe and encrypted, and I can have conversations that I may not want to have through Meta that's using their platforms to sell me shoes. And, you know, we have to be really careful and spend a lot more time picking our social media platforms like we pick our clothes or to buy a car. And we need to be a lot more intentional. So a lot of it still is on us, but you know,
as in citizens and government.
Yeah, of course. A lot of it still is on us in terms of citizens. We always should have agency. But what I have a problem with is when people tell me it's all my responsibility and the governments say, well, we're not going to get into that. Or political parties or political leaders say that they're not accountable for how a woman is treated online as a candidate, for instance. You know, we need them to all step in and take part. They want to lead us. So we spend half our lives on these platforms. Maybe they should join in the conversation and lead us there.
But how do we then find the balance? How do governments find the balance between, so they need to promote this sort of regulations, they need to respect individual privacy, and still not venture into some sort of a surveillance state that monitors everything in order to help you dissect between the correct and incorrect information? It's, I mean, obviously it's such an abstract problem, but probably like one of the biggest problems that we have today. How do they manage that fine line?
The things that we found that are the most effective is when they say they pass a law that says we need to start determining what is, safe and unsafe in terms of children, for instance. But I don't need parliamentarians to decide that. You can appoint independent boards that involve child psychologists. They involve academic researchers. They can also require tech companies to provide that information so that we can make better decisions of what harms are actually happening, what they're doing about it when they address it. So those are some very practical terms. Instead of just setting up a law and saying it's illegal, we have to think about this as more of an ongoing conversation, just like we do around regulating the economy. We don't just have one conversation and say that's going to work for 20 years. It's a constant state of meetings. This is probably not a fair comparison. Maybe it is, because maybe the robots and the internet are killing us. But I like to think about it in terms of arms control and weapons of mass destruction, right? For 50, 60 years, it's been a series of really boring meetings that people get together and have that have kept us alive on this planet and prevented those people from using those things. And it really is going to take a long, sustained series of conversations to begin to get this more right every day. So it's not as bad as it used to be, but there's so much work to do.
Sorry, but when it comes to media literacy and being able to think critically, obviously, we probably need more programs in high schools and primary schools when it comes to those topics. Is NDI doing any sort of programs for educational purposes of that sort?
Where we focus our education is around things we're good at, like elections. How do we educate different entities that help run elections? How do we educate newsrooms on how to cover it? How do we educate civil society on how to teach the public about where to get credible information about a candidate, to learn about what they're looking at? And where
As a sort of like a fact checker platform, or
sometimes there are fact checkers that are part of the process. Sometimes, and by the way, NDI is not sitting in Washington with a bunch of computers, right? Our role is to empower local communities in Montenegro or in other countries to look at their own social media environment, hold leaders accountable. Sometimes that's fact checking. Sometimes that's releasing their own information with their own analysis on, say, ethnic, attacks on one or another, or monitoring the attacks that politicians make on each other and releasing that to the public, and sort of naming and shaming. There are a lot of creative activities out there. What we try to do is empower them to do it. We're not the experts. What we can do is help identify best practices and then share those as widely as possible, because why start from scratch? If our Taiwanese friends have made really great progress in how to fact check and debunk, then let's let them talk to other people in Latin America or in Asia or in Europe and say, this is what we've done. Here's our code. Take it, go forth, and do great work.
About that specific case. What is it based on? Are you more familiar with the technicality of how did they develop those fact checkers, and what are they based on?
Oh, we spend a lot of time talking with our partners about the ethical tech that they will build, how they're going to approach privacy concerns, how they're going to approach human rights and inclusion. What we really want to do, because we're about democracy, right? It's about making people have those conversations and not just assume, I built a thing, it's great. We want them to think critically about, can a disabled person use this product that you say could help access the government and access more information? Can they? Is it, is there a caption in front of it? Can they voice translate it if they're blind? And does it consider all ethnic concerns? Again, I have never found one that doesn't need tweaking and changing on an active basis. But to be honest, neither is Mark Zuckerberg. He's never stopped developing Facebook since the day it started. And so why would we expect that he's going to think that way, but that governments, politicians, that they don't have to think about that in the same way, that it's an ongoing process.
I'm sure they have to use some sort of a database of information or some place where they pull the information from to check whether something is correct or not. Do you have any list of like verified sources that we can use as not even 100, maybe not 100% correct, but something that we can compare the information we usually check with. So is there any sources that we can definitely, I mean, not Wikipedia definitely, but something that we can, I don't know, on a daily basis maybe see
what's true, what's not?
Well, yeah, exactly. What can help us at least? What do those fact checkers use to compare the information against?
One of the great things going on in the world is there is a network of fact checkers, and they operate according to a set of principles where they say what their standards are, and they're very transparent about how they make those judgments. And you can go on their websites and see a news piece and feel and trust that they're fact-checking that according to those principles, and they're being fact-checked by fact-checkers.
But that's an organization, or?
There's a global network of fact-checkers, and they're civil society. You know, they're not making any money off of it. They're supported by foundations, sometimes governments that are looking for being part of this solution, you know, Western governments, like-minded governments, but nobody tells them how to do it or what to fact check, right? They live there. They know what could be divisive and what needs to be clarified in order to provide citizens with trustworthy information. That's been a really important piece of this. And then what we need is for governments to listen to them and for newsrooms to listen to them and not just take the piece of content and go crazy before they fact check it. But that's just one piece. As you said, who's consuming it and how do they know how to consume it? And then how are we holding them accountable? So, for instance, we saw those fact checkers begin to change the nature of social media and begin to, Google, for instance, uses those fact checking networks to label their content and to adjust their algorithms based on what the fact checkers are saying and demote certain things that may not be trustworthy. Or on Facebook, you'll get a warning saying this may not be trustworthy. That's built on the work of civil society actors around the world.
Is that like a platform that we can access generally, or is it more of a
mostly behind the scenes and local? I would have to get back to you and check, and we can share that in afterwards with everyone of like where in the Balkans and in Europe you might. Like what those examples might be. But a good example in Ukraine, for instance, is the organization Stop Fake, which is done great work in using open source information that's going to inform citizens of what's real and what's not. But they only make up one part of this equation. We saw as many civil society actors also looking at the behavior online. So, for instance, the open source researchers at the DFR lab at the Atlantic Council who are global and they're citizen researchers, right? This is their hobby, but they're trained. They follow an ethical standard, and they try to share information. Wikimedia is another great one. Those are volunteers, but they adhere to a standard and they hold each other accountable to a standard. And what we've seen is something like Wikimedia cooperates with Google, and that's the first thing that pops up when you're looking for information. Is it perfect always? No. But when we do those comparisons with how true is Wikimedia versus how true is something else, Wikimedia is looking pretty good sometimes, right?
I haven't used it,
compared to your local news, you know?
Yeah. Which sort of platform do you use to check Balkans info?
That's a good question because I read a lot. I like traditional news sources. I like print media, big print media. So, for instance, the BBC and other sources that I know I can trust. Because I know their editorial standards and their editorial lines. You mentioned commentary earlier. I don't get a lot of news from my WhatsApp groups. Oh, that's outrageous. That's crazy. Or from the news where they're just talking to each other. I turn it off. There's no TV in our family room. That's really important. I think where I see a lot of this going, though, is that my kids get a lot of information online. And having to police that and having to look at what credible sources are and begin to teach them sometimes they'll learn like really interesting facts and they teach me a lot, as kids do. My son knows everything about the Premier League and it's all from YouTube.
I bet.
But that doesn't mean that he shouldn't stop, and I shouldn't, as a parent, look at what he's looking at and make sure he knows how to make decisions about what he's looking at.
Is there any digital curfew for your kids? Do you give them like an amount of hours?
I mean, it's longer in the summer, and sometimes I'm not as good at it as I should be. But it's more around them being accountable for their behavior every day. I want them to be good citizens online and offline, we have conversations about it. I mean, I work in democracy, so I don't run a democracy. There's a freedom of
speech in the house.
They can speak. It doesn't mean I'm responding. But I don't run a democracy in my house, I will be honest, but I will listen to them and I will engage them because I want them to learn and I want them to grow and I want them to be better and I want our democracy to be better. And for us, this is why working on technology issues across the board, whether it be surveillance tech that you mentioned, disinformation, the rules of the road at the United Nations for how the internet is governed. Those are all issues we spend a lot of time on, but we also spend time on empowering our partners to have these conversations about what works here locally and how we hold political parties accountable for not yelling at each other. And, there's enough to attack on the issues.
There's enough work at that.
I don't need to listen to what they think about somebody's hair or appearance or the way they talk or the way they laugh or any of the other things.
Do you invest any amount of resources in the cybersecurity on helping countries develop those abilities, capacities?
So the number one need that we've seen for our partners is not to focus on the cybersecurity needs of countries, but rather to focus on the digital security needs of our partners. Unfortunately, there's a big report called Freedom on the Net that my good friends over at Freedom House put out every year and tell us, are we more free or less free in a given country? What we track every year is more government shutdowns, more surveillance technology. And so we have a big need to give our partners not just the tools, not just VPNs, that we see, for instance, like people in Ukraine or Russia have been using, but also to think about what they want to do, how they want to be out there and publicly engage, and use, another partnership that we have is with a company called Cloudflare that has a project called Project Galileo, and they protect the websites of a lot of civil society groups that are doing transparency work that governments attack because they're being held accountable on it, and they protect them for free. That's really important work. And it's very behind the scenes. It's not something everyone knows about, but in order for democratic voices, and I don't just mean like, therefore democracy, we're talking women's movements, indigenous movements, LGBTQI groups. In order for them to be able to do their work, they need to be able to know they can operate safely. And that's a big, big focus, unfortunately, of our work right now.
What's your favorite, I gotta ask, what's your favorite social media platform where you are?
Where I spend way too much time?
Yeah.
That's a really good question. I, of course, spend way too much time on Slack because I work too much with my friends. WhatsApp with my family. I'm from a really big family, so we were early adopters of WhatsApp because of the number of people. Yeah. And I have, thousands of WhatsApp groups, I feel like, at this point. For entertainment, I'd say I'm an Instagram person.
Okay.
I'm not a big fan of the way TikTok operates personally. So I don't use them, and I'll go to Instagram, and that's where I'll stay up too late, maybe watching videos.
But at the end of the day, it always comes to kids. And for example, one of my cases is I have a cousin, two of them essentially, that I've put like family link on their phones so I can monitor the use of apps. And you can quickly see, for example, the use of YouTube, and then I limit that, but then TikTok comes up, but then I limit that. And it's like always another app. And then after a couple of weeks, they called me and they said, due to all these restrictions that I put on them, they have learned how to use their phone the best they ever managed. So they managed to literally find this as a learning experience, to find loopholes in my ability to control the information used. So essentially, I'm producing the worst than I should have if I hadn't...
Or they can use that power to help democracy activists around the world,
it's a gamble.
resistance movements.
I'm hoping for the best case.
Use that skill to be able to have that conversation.
But it's insane how quickly they can learn.
Yeah.
I mean, how quickly they can find loopholes, and not even considering potential dangers, they just want to use their phone. If you take it away from them, they'll go to a group of people that also has a phone. And what did you do? So I think that still, I think a book came out called Anxious Generation from Jonathan Haidt, if I remember correctly, and it shows these correlations of mental health and all of this. And I think this is I keep saying it is the most important topic of today. So at the end, are you optimistic? What's your take?
I am optimistic when I hear stories of success. When I see, I'm optimistic about governments taking actions faster on like how fast they moved on OpenAI and on generative AI tools, and to begin to think about what the right rules of the road were for those. That makes me optimistic. I'm also optimistic when I see civil society actors getting creative. There was a member of parliament that I spoke with. It's in the news. I can share the link. And she was a Somali member of parliament. She had to leave Somalia and go into hiding in Kenya. Well, the Somali diaspora is all over the world. And so she found one of her attackers and identified who he was. And he lived in the Netherlands. So she sued him. And
she came over to the Netherlands
and sued him and got a conviction. And that kind of creativity is really, really great. And I want to tell her story. But I also want her not to have to do that.
Not to have that story in the first place.
Yeah, wouldn't it be great if she was just in Somalia making things happen for people like food and jobs and democracy and empowerment? That's what I really want. So we have a long way to go, but the civil society actors, the cool people that I've met who are being creative about tracking disinformation, helping us all create the information integrity space that we want. The people who are standing up and saying that we're not going to do this anymore, and sometimes even tech companies that will sometimes, every now and then, do the right thing and help us. It has me optimistic that we have a great community. It's civil society. If I could put bets on any part of this equation, it would be on civil society leaders who lead local NGOs who are doing the best work I've seen.
Well, what would you suggest now to regular Montenegrin citizen when they're participating in this digital space? What couple of advice maybe would you give them to be not even more secure, but find a way to cope with this sort of onslaught of disinformation?
Well, I think what I would do is a few things. One, before I became part of the problem, I would stop. And we talk about rethink, reassess as a tip and a rule of the road before you share something that you don't know whether it's true or not, that you try to see if you can source it. And if you can't, maybe just don't. Or ask someone, have you seen that? Is it true? And pause and don't become part of the problem. Second, put accountability on these politicians who we want to prioritize this, and that we want to say, hey, you have agency here. You have to behave properly, and you also have to pass regulation with us that we want, that we've helped you develop. Not you pass a fake news law that benefits you, but that you begin to speak with us and we develop an institution that's going to help address these problems. Those are really, I think, the calls to action. I think the biggest challenge we face in Montenegro,
personal ownership, personal responsibility.
And turning it off, right? We don't want to say all the politicians are the same. They're all terrible. I'm just going to sit at home. That's what is the worst thing for democracy. I want people to be able to feel like they can be part of the conversation actively. I want women to feel like they can have an opinion about the education of their children or their workplace and not be attacked for how they look or how they behave in their life. And some of those workplaces are our government and our politics. And
I always ask this question at the very end. If, for example, let's assume you had a majority share in all the social media companies, and you had to implement a couple of quick, not even regulations, but a couple of quick decisions that can propagate, what would those be in order to help with this issue?
The number one thing I would do is make sure people in my front office represented the world. That's really hard to do. But when you think about how small those teams are that are making such big decisions that have consequences, they're making decisions on the size of a country, the size. So the EU gets a lot more attention than, a small African country, for instance, because of the number of users that they have in that space. That's wrong. Because if you're going to be in the public space, you need to be accountable to creating a space for all people. Every election is important. And just because it's an election in a small country doesn't mean those people don't have a right to their voice mattering. That would be the first one.
So making a more diverse team.
Yeah. And the second would be committing to transparency, committing proactively to telling people what happens when we make decisions, how we make decisions, and explaining that. Some companies do that better than most. Again, it's the problem with a lot of that information's out there. It just where you find it and finding the website that explains it can be hard. So committing the time and energy to that, because so many companies consider those basic actions to be what we call a cost center. That costs too much to do the right thing. It cuts into our profit margin, as you say. And I think maybe just profit isn't the end all be all.
It shouldn't be. Yeah.
I mean, do we all need statues of our wives in our backyard? I mean, that's Mark Zuckerberg, his gift to his wife recently.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, he had a statue made of her. So, it's great. I'm glad he's a wife guy. But we do need to find ways where we can hold these companies accountable to the basic human rights they've committed to. And we all have to do that. But we need governments and politicians to stop putting all the responsibility on us and start taking some for themselves.
Moira, thanks a lot for taking the time and being the guest in our podcast.
This is fantastic. I really am so glad you've had me here. And I'm really glad that this is your passion project and that you're educating a lot of people.
Thanks.